Good evening, everyone. My name is Justin Reinhardt. I'm an extension beef cattle specialist with the University of Tennessee Department of Animal Science. I'd like to welcome you to our first webinar of the spring 2021 Master Beef Producer webinar series. Have a good lineup in store for you over the next few weeks. We'll be meeting here at the same time on Mondays for including this week for 9 weeks. And like I say, have a really good lineup of speakers. I'm really excited about our webinar series here this evening. So I'll be starting you off every week whenever we have a new webinar coming up. I'd like to also introduce to you Courtney Carter. Courtney is a beef program coordinator here with University of Tennessee, and she'll be helping facilitate the webinars. And then the third person on each webinar will be our speaker, and I'll introduce our speaker here in just a few moments after I get us started. One thing we do like to try to do on this webinar series is stay on time. So I'm not going to take a tremendous amount of time to get us started. But for this first webinar of the series, I will take a little more time than I normally do to explain the procedure to you, let you know kind of all the process we'll be going through the rest of the webinar series. And I'm actually going to show a little video too here for this one starting out that I may or may not show for the rest of them in the series, just to explain a little bit more. So with that, one of the things that we've really been delighted to have as a part of our Tennessee Master Beef Producer program is a partnership with the U.S. Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, and more specifically within that, the Golden State Foods and Nestle, who are both members of the U.S. Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, as well as University of Tennessee Institute of Agriculture. So through that, the networking connections at some of those meetings, our representative to that is Dr. Bates. Many of you know Dr. Bates, our forage specialist. He made some networking connections within those meetings, and we started talking, or they started talking about what sustainability really means to cow-calf producers, and they developed a really nice set of metrics for you to be able to evaluate your own program, to just see how sustainable you really are in producing the beef cattle that you raise each year. And with that, you wanted to test the metrics that they came up with. And so we're incorporating that into this webinar series by some of the questions that we'll be asking and some of the interactions that we have throughout the webinar series. And Golden State Foods and Nestle has been kind enough to help facilitate the platform, the cost of the platform here, and just the cost of running these webinars so that we can help them evaluate those metrics. I could tell you a lot about what the U.S. Roundtable for Sustainable Beef is, but I'd rather show you a video that's on their website. And before I show that, I'll actually draw your attention to a couple of the websites I have listed here on the slide. One is the home page for the U.S. Roundtables for Sustainable Beef at usrsb.org. And then a lot of the resources they have for evaluating yourself in your own production scenario as far, relative to sustainability is beefsustainability.us. So I'd really encourage you to visit those websites, do a little research on the U.S. Roundtable, and look at what it really is, because what we know it to be through our partnership with UT Institute of Agriculture is an organization that has entities and groups and representation from across the beef production chain, and really so that beef cattle producers and every step in the chain has a voice in defining what sustainability is, so that doesn't get defined by somebody outside of what we actually do. And really encourage the thought of sustainability, not just from an environmental standpoint, which is an important part of it that we do a lot of anyway as beef cattle producers, but also generational sustainability and economic sustainability, and those things that really, come together to form what we think of as sustainability for being able to stay in beef cattle production. So with that, I'll attempt to actually show their video. Let me pull this over.
Responsibility. It's the everyday call to care for the lands for the animals, for the people, for the planet itself, as we work dawn to dusk and to dawn again. Because it's more than just a job, it's our first love. But Mother Nature deals a difficult hand, we'll outlast it. As consumer demands shift, we'll listen, we'll learn, we'll adapt, we'll become stronger. Because when it comes to our lives and our land, fences define borders, but innovation knows no bounds. We are never alone on this journey. We learn from each other, teach each other, and understand differences often just bring us closer. Because when we can connect one idea to another, we put our resources to better use. To ensure excess water finds its way to corn, alfalfa, and our very families. To ensure our beef makes it to the plate of every dinner table. We'll band with more partners, more like-minded people, willing to do the hard things, the right things, keeping their minds set on sustainability and their hearts set on this life. It's about believing in our product, our process, our care, our mindfulness, our lands, our people. For everything and everyone, it starts here. It began there. Continues here. And here. And here. And there. And it comes together here. Join us, the U.S. Roundtable for Sustainable Beef.
Okay, well, hopefully that showed. If that did not come through for some of you, don't worry about it. That's kind of a little bit of a test too, to see if we'd be able to functionally play a video throughout this. But hopefully that gives you an idea of why we've partnered with Golden State Foods, Nestle, and through the U.S. Roundtable for Sustainable Beef to, again, keep a Tennessee producer voice in shaping that discussion around what sustainability is. And really a lot of it, maybe the summary statement would be to give you credit for the sustainable practices that you already do that naturally are market driven, that you need to do to stay in business, and make sure that folks know that we are sustainable in a lot of ways, and again, help guide that discussion. So I'll mention here a couple of other things just as far as the way we'll operate as we go through this webinar series. There'll be a few questions that the presenters will ask you actually during the webinar, and that will pop up on your screen. If you're watching this in the actual Zoom app, if it's on the desktop app, or I think even on the mobile application, you'll be able to answer these questions and interact with the speaker for that night, and we'll be able to get an idea of the distribution of the kind of things you do. What you see here on the screen is just an example question. This one isn't live, but that's what it'll look like when it pops up on your screen. So for instance, tonight, Dr. Stewart might ask you a question, or I think he has about 4 sprinkled throughout the presentation. Courtney will facilitate that question. It'll pop up. You'll be able to answer it on your screen. Now, if you're in a group and you're not able to interact in that way, it's not a problem. There'll be enough people that can answer the question that give us a fair sample of the folks watching and how they operate and what they do. And then the speaker will be able to take that information to guide what they say through the rest of the presentation. So we have those throughout the process, throughout the webinars, just so we can interact with you. Now, if you'd like to ask a question, you'll see a QA icon that are on the controls for Zoom, and you'll be able to click that. A box will pop up that looks similar to what's on your page here, and you'll be able to type a question in there. And what I'll do is that now I won't be answering all of those questions, and likely won't attempt to answer many of them unless they're just a procedural or a logistics type question. But if they're a question about what our speaker is talking about, Then I'll kind of put those together, curate those, and then we'll leave some time at the end of each webinar for Q&A. And since this is a webinar where we don't see your video, we won't be able to hear your audio. That will be how I get questions to ask the presenter, and then the presenter and I'll have a discussion, and that hopefully we'll get some of your questions answered throughout it. So, we do it as a webinar rather than a meeting, because if we had this many people, we're getting close, it looks like, on participants to 500 people connected tonight, 490. And you can imagine if we had that many videos going at once and people muting and unmuting, it'd just be really difficult to keep track of. So we do it this way as a webinar where we don't see your video or hear your audio. So this is the way we need to interact for questions. There's also a chat function on here where you can chat with the moderators, Courtney, myself, and tonight Lawton. So if you need to type in the chat, we can try to help you out there, but I'll be monitoring the Q&A box if you have questions about the topics, the content presented in the actual talk tonight. So the other thing that I'll mention before I introduce Lawton too is that there might be some questions about how you go through seeing enough of the content that we'll deliver in this series to warrant getting a Master Bee Producer certificate. And of course, everything that we do in UT Extension is delivered through our counties. So your local connection to the Tennessee Master Bee Producer Program is your UT Extension A&R agent in your county. Often we talk about, you have a front door to the University of Tennessee in every county in the state, and that's certainly true with the Master Bee Producer Program. So if you have questions like that about, like, if you miss one of the webinars, we'll have these recorded, and your agent can help you link up with those recordings to be able to watch them after the fact. But again, the management of that at the local level goes through your A&R agent in your county, so your UT Extension agent in your county. So talk to them if you'd like to ask some questions about that, and they'll be able to get you directed in the right way and make it easy enough for you to get accreditation or get certification for the program. I stumbled around here a little bit because I realized that I didn't change the title on this slide. Lawton, you okay with talking about anaplasm BVD tonight? Probably not. So instead of talking about anaplasm BVD, Lawton's going to be talking about weaning and backgrounding, preconditioning calves. So I apologize for that. Hopefully we'll get this straightened out and get in a good flow as we get into the webinar series here this evening. I always got to make a mistake and get a little bit humble, I guess, as we get started. So let me introduce Dr. Stewart. So Lawton Stewart is a faculty member in the Department of Animal Science at the University of Georgia, and has been for quite a while. He's actually a Georgia native as well, and has some family history in extension work. But he's a beef cattle specialist trained in ruminant nutrition. So for a lot of questions that I've gotten in the past about nutrition management, those are some things I'd call Lawton up. He and I have been good friends for a long time, worked together for several years, and I'd call him up and ask him these nutrition questions. And the thing about Dr. Stewart is it's not just that he's trained in the basic science of ruminant nutrition, but he knows the actual application of it. He knows about the ins and outs of feeding cattle and actual day-to-day management. So really excited to have Lawton with us here this evening to talk about weaning and preconditioning your calves. And with that, Lawton, I'm going to stop share and then turn it over to you, unless you just want to talk about BVDV and anaplasm. What do you think?
Sure, I could probably talk about it. I don't know how much good information they'll get that they'll be able to apply when they go home. But
yeah.
If that's the worst mistake tonight, then I think we're doing pretty good on the presentation side. But wanted to say thank you to Justin and Courtney for inviting me. And let me get my title slide pulled up and shared. All right, y'all should see that. And let me get in presentation mode. All right, are y'all seeing that presentation?
Yes, we've got it. Looks good.
All right, good deal. Well, like I said, appreciate y'all letting me be here. It would have been great to come up to Tennessee and see what was going on up there, but considering the pandemic, it's a great opportunity to use technology like Zoom so that we could do these things. I'll have all of a 20-step commute tonight when I get done walking from the office into the living room. But with that, what we talked about, or what this topic will be to get us kicked off, is they asked me to talk about weaning and backgrounding your calf crop, and we'll talk about some general management. There's a lot of things we can talk about. So the ultimate goal is looking at what's going to hopefully help you add profit to your operation, and we're going to focus mainly on nutrition in this, but we'll cover some other things. But before we get started, Courtney, I believe we have a few questions we want to ask them.
Yes, let me pull up question 1. Okay, so I just launched question 1. You should have seen it pop up on your screen. The question is, do you background your cattle post weaning? So just simple yes or no. Do you background your cattle post weaning?
And what we were getting at there is, do you just sell them straight to the barn, or do you retain that ownership and do any type of management after you wean them off their mama?
We got a lot of answers coming in. I'll give about 15 more seconds if you haven't answered.
Lawton and I were talking about if I have some questions as we get to some of the other questions he's going to ask in here, might be able to fill that time with getting him to answer a few of those. But in the last series, Courtney told some jokes, and I think everybody might be expecting some jokes. Do you have any ready, Courtney?
Yeah, I'll tell one next question.
Okay.
There's the results for this one, Dr. Stewart.
So that would be what I consider about normal, about a 50-50 split on doing not preconditioned and preconditioned. I believe we have one more. Courtney, is that all right?
Yep.
While she's pulling that up before she tells her joke, I'm going to admit this is the first time I've ever eaten chicken before a cattlemen's meeting, and I will not blame that on the University of Tennessee. That's my fault. And this one, do you purchase your calves? So in addition to your own calves, do any of you purchase those calves to stock or background? All right, now, Courtney, it's time for your joke, I think.
Okay. So what have pigs been using to stay safe during coronavirus?
I give up. I don't know. Justin.
Ham sanitizer.
Nice.
That's been about the way it's been going on.
Everyone likes them, but Justin. Okay, I'm gonna.
He's mad because he didn't think of them first. All right.
There's the results for that one.
So there's a few out there that are purchasing them, and most of this will be applicable to both, whether you're buying calves or you're doing your own calves. But some of these things may be a little more specific to some of those, to those that are doing their own, and some of those that are purchasing calves. But when we think about weaning and backgrounding calves, it can be a fairly intimidating situation because there's a lot of things you have to consider. Ultimately, you're taking on more risk. Anytime you own an animal longer, then it means that you're assuming more risk that can happen during that period. We're hoping that the reward outweighs the risk. But if you get into a bad situation, it can be hard to dig out. This is actually some pictures of us putting out hay last year when it was so wet. But hopefully we can learn from our mistakes, whether we've made them or we know somebody that makes them. Through these communities, we can visit and say, well, this worked for me, this did not. But hopefully through this, it'll give you some ideas, some concepts of how you can, whether you're already backgrounding your calves, you can do some practices that may help out there. Or if you're some of those that are not, maybe it's a management strategy that you can consider incorporating into your management practice. So ultimately, what is our goal as beef cattle producers? Well, it's fairly simple. We're in the business to make money. We are paid for pounds of beef, and also tell people we're paid for healthy animals. And that's where some of this preconditioning comes in. So what will the strategy be is to implement practices that's going to increase the value. So we're going to go through some of those. So if we look at value-added feeder calves, what are some of the things we typically discuss? We talk a lot about uniformity. That has to do both with your breeding program, but also the way you manage them, that controlled breeding season, getting them on a tighter window so your calves are uniform in size. Good management, the castration, the dehorning, preconditioning. We'll focus on the nutrition. I assume there's going to be one of the veterinarians is going to discuss some vaccination protocols and herd health identification. BQA certified, I'd say that's a no-brainer. Let's tell our story, and then keep good records. So we have that we have to pass on with some of the programs we use. And if we think about it, so now let's jump back and let's think about the animal. A lot of times when I give these talks, I say, let's think about the animal and understand the animal. And then we're going to develop our management strategies around that. So if we look at this calf, we got the calf in the top left, and we're wanting somehow to end up with this good looking feeder calf down in the bottom right. But what does this calf go through to get there? Well, there's weaning. And there's a lot of different ways we can do that. Some of us employ strategies such as fence line weaning. Some may use nose clip, some way to reduce the stress, or some of us just put them on the trailer straight off of mama and take them to the sale barn. And then we talk about transportation. Are they going to a sale ring? Are they going on a semi? But ultimately, what I'm trying to get at here is there's a lot that happens in that calf's life between being a calf on its mama's side all the way to being this high value feeder calf. And the biggest thing from a management standpoint that we battle is stress. And one of our veterinarians down here, I think he said it best. He said, there's going to be a stress in the calf's life, but really the best thing we can do is try to spread it out, minimize it and spread it out. So it's not too much of a burden at one time, because that's when we get in trouble. And we think about stress. What is it? There's different types of stress, and how does it affect our cattle? There's environmental stress, excessive heat or cold, housing, cleanliness. If we're dealing with a lot of mud, we're a little damp this year. We got a lot of mud we're dealing with. That adds stress to the animal. Inflammatory stress. Essentially, this is disease exposure. But also, we got to think about the vaccination process. Is an inflammatory response. It adds some stress to that animal. We got to think about that as well. And I tell people, think about your flu shot, or even now your COVID vaccination. You don't feel good for a day because your immune system's having to kick in and learn how to fight that illness. And then perceived stress. This is, I call it kindergarten syndrome. It's the first day of kindergarten. There's that commingling, that depression of being pulled away from its mama, put with a bunch of other calves, from a bunch of different places, balling calves, and that's that perceived stress. So these are the types of stress we think about with feeder calves, and we're trying to take this and minimize it and spread it out so that we can also keep those animals gaining. So some of the things we typically traditionally talk about is a simple thing. One, are your calves dehorned? And this is some classical data from Arkansas. It's 15 years old now, almost 16 years old. But just simply looking at horned versus polled animals, and what that either you could say was a discount or a premium for having those dehorned cattle. But then we talk a lot about banding calves, bulls versus steers. And you can see this, again, now they have this spread out, steers versus bulls versus heifers, and the discount compared to steers. And we see that discount for bulls. And the biggest argument we get is, well, those bulls grow faster. So at this point, we discussed the benefit of a bull versus a steer and that additional growth. I believe we have another question for the crowd, Courtney.
Yeah, give me just a second.
And are there any jokes while we ask, do you castrate your calves?
Oh, I really just do one per webinar.
Oh, so we're out of jokes. All right, Justin, are there any questions yet?
Yes, actually, a really good question that I often overlook some terminology and things, but just go ahead and, if you don't mind, give us your definition of backgrounding, and maybe with that, a few other definitions of, backgrounding versus stocker, precondition, weaning, that kind of stuff.
Sure. So I think there's some of these terms we tend to use interchangeably. But that's a great question. So we typically talk about backgrounding. You're giving that animal the background it needs to be successful, or preconditioning. You're putting it through a conditioning process prior to being sold. Typically, we talk about a preconditioner, maybe in a background program being 45 to 60 days. In my mind, I think about that. And then a stocker program is something that we're going to retain ownership longer than 60 days. It is a grass, a forage based, where we're trying to add more weight. The real focus on is keeping them for longer periods of time. Sometimes we're going up to 120, 150 days on those stocker cattle. Justin, you may have a different definition or something you'd like to add to that.
No, that's great. That's the way I think about it. Basically, I just think of backgrounding is on a commodity feed or a delivered ration. Stockering is grazing. A real simple kind of term, but exactly what you said. The kind of understanding those differences in that, and sometimes I think we have with the amount of folks that we have on here, we'll have some newer producers, new to the business. And I'm really bad about, glossing over some terms like that. So if you think of it as you go, maybe just,
Sure.
giving some background, no pun intended, to the terminology.
And if there's any of those, don't hesitate, Justin, to pause real quick and say, hey, will you explain what you mean here?
Good. And while you're on this question, and you may already be planning to do it, but we've got some questions coming in about which is less stressful, banding or castrating, which is better, that kind of thing.
Sure. And this could be a discussion, because it's kind of like skinning a cat, I guess, the not to be too much of a cliche, but there's a bunch of different ways. In my mind, the band is something earlier in life, or when we get to that post weaning. Some people like to use some of those technologies. I'm a bigger fan of the younger they are, the better. And I'm a fan of a knife cut, just to get out of the way. Especially when we're in colder weather, the one thing about banding is if we're in warmer weather, you don't have as much blood, you don't have an open wound that you have to deal with. But you do have to be concerned about that you basically going to have some necrotic tissue there that's going to have to fall off. But I typically say the way I like to do it is do it as early as possible, within a week of being born, if you can, if you're catching them and tagging them, and try to cut them as soon as you can. Ultimately, I say, though, you do whatever you can do in your management system.
Yep.
And we can get in some other ones with something like a Newberry knife or a masculatone, those types of things, some different things that can be used to castrate those calves. I'm not going to get into those different things, but possibly that can build into another discussion, or we can pull up some pictures later on.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Opinion, Justin, do you have any?
My opinion, definitely with you on earlier the better. And as you get to some of those older bull calves, so like if you're a seed stock producer and you need to wait a little while to make that decision, or whether or not you're going to keep him as a bull to market as a to commercial producer, when you get up to those bigger ages, heavier weights, I would start making some different decisions on some of the banding technologies and cutting, just depending on what time of year it is.
Sure.
So I'm with you 100%, man.
And it looks like the majority of people are doing some type of castration, which is great. There are a few out there that are not. And so I won't spend a lot of time on the let me prove to you why you should. But this is just one slide, some information. It's from Europe, but still, it looked at age of castration and growth rate. And so you can see pre-weaning, post-weaning, and then finishing. And you can see that, so if we castrate them within 2 months, they did gain slower than those that had their testicles. But the big thing we try to emphasize is the stress. So you do get that gain pre-weaning, but once you castrate them, you castrate an older animal, they're a little more attached, literally and figuratively, to those testicles. And so it's going to stress them out a lot more. It's going to be a lot harder for them to get over that. And so you can see here where that post-weaning, 1.65 pounds for those that were castrated 8 months before weaning versus those that are castrated at weaning. But it's interesting, you can see even through that finishing phase, those that were castrated at a younger age maintain that benefit. So there's likely what I would say has happened in this 10-month-old, those that are being castrated at weaning at 10 months of age, is going to predispose them to some other illnesses that they just don't get over. With that, so the next idea is vaccination protocols. And I put this up here not to say, hey, here's the one you need to use, because one, these lists are these companies are ever changing. But the goal is you need to put some of this together. And so the questions we get a lot are, well, which one's which? What's the 5-way? What's the black leg? And so the only reason I put this up here is show you some of those companies so you can understand which one is which when you hear these things like Caliber or Bovishield Gold, which two go together. So you're not giving Pyramid 5 and Bovishield Gold, but you know to give Bovishield Gold and Ultra Choice 7. A combination of a 5-way modified live or killed vaccine, and then a black leg, and making sure those are boosted properly prior to weaning. Most of you may have been through BQA, but remember about proper injection and knowing the difference between sub-Q, needle size, needle length, and then intramuscular, and where those are to be put. And ultimately, we're trying to improve the value of that carcass once it goes on in places. We typically talk about the triangle in the neck and where to do intramuscular and where to do sub-Q. And then finally, records. Keeping good records. Animal ID. I tell people the easiest thing to do is just grab a book, one of these, a little red book, or if you're an Angus producer, you may have a little black book, fits in the front pocket of your shirt or on the dashboard of your truck, and you just start keeping records, anything you can, as far as the animal ID, when they were born, what any treatment records were, record all the sales, or it may be even something like this. If you're old school, we just made a sheet that you can print off. So this is just something that's for each cow. You have a cow ID. You have all our calving records in one place. And these start opening up the doors for some of the not branded programs, but the, oh, my mind's going blank. I apologize. But some of our programs are preconditioned programs where you have to have a verified birth range on these animals. And it's going to take some verification. But I do put this, I'm going to pull this up. There's a lot of numbers here, but give you background. Some of these things we talk about, if we implement them, it opens up doors for programs that we can be involved with. And this is some data from a graded feeder calf sale we helped get going here in Georgia. And you may have some of these in Tennessee. But one of the things our producers face is our average producer size is about 30 head. So when it comes time to market those cattle, they don't have enough to put a full truckload together. And I've done a lot of these farm visits, and they're doing the vaccination, the castration. They're getting the horns off of them, usually through breeding. But then they take them to the sale barn where they're sold one at a time. And so they're losing that value that they're trying to put into those animals. So not to get too far into this, but one of these programs, this is an example of where a graded feeder calf sale, a producer can bring 5 head or he can bring 50 head or however many he wants to. But there's a set standard, a set protocol they use from a vaccination protocol, background protocol, and keeping up their information. And when they're brought to a central location, then they're sorted with like cattle based on sex, muscle grade, hide color, weight, and sold to add value. And this was the first one we did. And of the 1,600 head that went into that, this is a spreadsheet. There's a lot of things on here, but what I tried to do is for each one of those pens that sold, I got the value. I have all this information on them. And then what I did is I went to our market report for the same week for the state of Georgia, because we had there were cattle from all over, and got the value based on sex, muscle score, and weight of what the approximate value would be in Georgia. And what we found out on average is I don't know if you can see on your screen, but down here, let me get my pointer. You see down here, 139 across all those pens. That was the average increase in value we added per animal for going through this program compared to the average price in Georgia for that week. And you can see some of these loads actually were as high as $300. So I just give that as some real world example of how we can implement these programs, even for a smaller producer, and then capture that value and make more money in our program. I gave this not long after we did that first sale, and one of the producers there, he said, "I'm gonna argue with you," and I thought I was gonna get in big trouble. He said, after I said $140 a head, he said, "I'm gonna argue with you. I don't think you're right." And I kind of got a little nervous, and I said, "Okay, let me hear it." He said, "You're wrong, because I made more than that." So we definitely had a lot of success stories out of this, and I'm sure y'all may have some of those in Tennessee. But now what I want to do is shift gears a little bit and focus on the nutrition part, because as we said in the beginning, we're getting paid for those healthy calves that add weight to them. We're looking at, they weighed this at weaning. How can we add more weight on them and add this value through our program? So from a nutritional standpoint, one, what are we facing? We understand that animal. We've talked a little bit about that. We're looking at feeder calves or weaned calves. What are our feed options? What do we have to feed them? And how do we put that together? What do we need to consider to make sure they're moving forward? And then also minerals. Minerals is actually a very important part during this post-weaning phase, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. But to start off with nutrition, and this is a great way of how I feel like I can sum up the concept of nutrition, apply nutrition in one slide. So how do we visualize nutrition? I start with this picture. I get this from one of our county agents, sends me this picture and says, "Hey, Lawton, I think we got a copper problem." And you say, "Okay, why is that?" And if we look here, we tend to say this dingy hair coat is associated with copper deficiency, and sometimes we say fescue, that inability to slick off. But if we look closer, we really need to look at the big picture. So if we use this picture, for example, what else is going on? Well, there's Mama in the background. She's a body condition score 3.5 at best. The only thing really taller than an inch off the ground are the weeds on the fence line. So we got to look at the big picture. And the concept, one of the professors I had in school, he called it, I believe the official term is the Labix principle, but I refer to it as the rain barrel principle. Or if I'm teaching guest lecturing to college students, I call it the whiskey barrel principle. But the idea is, if we have this rain barrel, and you're going to put this thing together and hold water, and I give you the pieces, but all these different slats are different lengths. You're going to put that together, and how full is that barrel going to get? Well, it's going to be as full as the most limiting or the shortest slat, right? So we're going to compare this to animal production. And so we're going to say each slat is a nutritional component, and the water capacity equals animal performance. So then the idea becomes animal performance is as good as the most limiting nutrient. So we look at this, let's say we go out, we do a forage test, we look at what feed's available, we look at the mineral tag, and this is what we find out. So we have, this is their situation, and do we have a copper problem? Sure we do. It's the most limiting nutrient, so that's what's limiting our animal performance. Now, if we just looked at the hair coat and said, "Yep, we got a copper problem, let's increase the copper in their mineral, or let's use an injectable mineral or chelated mineral or something," are we going to improve animal performance? Well, sure we are, because if we hit them with a slug of copper, we've gotten it all the way up to here, where selenium now is the most limiting nutrient. So we improved animal performance just a little bit, but we weren't being efficient with our strategy. And we actually overfeeding this copper. We may be spending way more money than we need to. But if we look at the big picture, we know where we need the energy, the protein, the phosphorus, the zinc, the copper, and the selenium, but we don't need the calcium, the sulfur, or the magnesium. And so that's how we look at this in the big picture, or simplify a simple way to think about this. And you'll see that I said that we start off with testing our forages. And I often say that if you don't get anything else out of a talk I give on nutrition, testing your forages is the biggest return on investment you'll see in your production system. And with that, I believe, Courtney, we have another question to ask.
Yep, there you go. So just
simple yes or no. Do you test your forages?
And Lawton, while they're working on that, I'm not sure if you're planning on getting into talking about any creep feeding prior to weaning or anything like that, but did have a question about creep feeding.
I do have a slide. I don't talk necessarily about I will talk about some of the benefits. I tell you what, why don't you just hold that one, and when we get to that slide, we'll talk about it then, if that's okay.
That's perfect.
All right.
Okay, I think that's most everyone, so I'm going to end and share with you.
That's about what I'd figure. It's one of those. It's a relatively simple technology, but the trick, and I'm even bad about it too, is just remembering to do it, or getting with the county agent to get the hay probe and get them out to help you, or if you don't have a hay probe. But it is a very useful tool with minimizing or being able to economically meet the nutritional requirements of our cattle. So with that, we'll move on. So when we start developing this nutritional program, what are we going to do as soon as we wean them, or maybe we start prior to with the creek feeding like we just talked about, is get them started right. Make sure they know where water and feed is. So this is, if we're doing our own calves, we go ahead. One of the benefits of a creek feed program is that you're introducing them to the concept of eating out of a trough, but also knowing where those are and how they are available. And the best thing for any type of program, whether it's preconditioning your own, backgrounding your own, or stocker cattle, is high quality forage, because we're going to try to keep that rumen functioning properly, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. But that is our best friend here, is keeping that rumen functioning properly. And we set our target gain. One thing we don't want to back up. A lot of times dry matter intake goes down, so we don't want that. We hopefully want to get them gaining between 2.5 pounds, depending on where they are. If they're under condition, we may need to push them a little harder. But we don't want to over condition these cattle, because that will decrease their value when we go to market them. Maximize that forage, whether we're talking about pasture or conserved forage, because typically our forage sources are most economical source of energy and protein available. And then when our animal requirements and forages don't come together, we develop an economical supplement strategy. And notice here, I don't say cheap supplement. And there's a difference between cheap and economical. I say cheap is the Walmart version or the dollar store version, whereas economical means that we're trying to be efficient with the nutrients we can provide, find the lowest cost per pound of energy and protein to deliver to these animals. Now, I talked about feed intake. And this is for newly arrived cattle. So these are a little higher stress. We do have some people buying cattle, but even depending on how we wean our own cattle, this could be a similar situation. But this is some good data from Oklahoma State. And they looked at days after arrival or days after weaning when they got there, and they split them up into healthy calves and sick calves. But you can see, if we look at the healthy calves, even a healthy calf is about 50% of their intake, what it should be in that first week. And it takes them almost 4 weeks to get back up to full feed. But then if you take one that's sick, remember we talked about that healthy calf is what we're getting paid for. You can see they never do get to the same intake of a healthy calf. And at the beginning, they're very low. And the concept then to think about then is, even though their intake is half what we need it to be, that doesn't mean their requirements are cut in half. And actually, if you think of the math, if we need them to consume this much of energy, protein, and let's say calcium, phosphorus, zinc, magnesium, copper, but they're only eating half of what we want them to, that means we got to double those nutrients to get enough into them. So that can be tricky. And then also understanding what exactly those nutrient requirements are. So if you want them to gain more, we got to feed them more, or feed them a more caloric, protein dense ration. And just to put this in here as a point of reference, you can see at different weights, 4 weight, 6 weight, and 8 weight cattle. If we want them to gain different amounts, we got to increase that protein, but also increase the energy. And one of the things I like to point out here in the slides, you can see that no matter what the gain is, anticipated gain, no matter what the size is, that energy, or TDN is what I use there, total digestible nutrients, is a way that we look at energy. It stays the same. So if we want a 400 weight calf to gain 2.5 pounds, I need 73.5. Or if we want an 800 pound calf, it's the same thing, 73.5. But you can see as that animal gets bigger, the protein requirement goes down. We tend to feed a little more as an insurance policy, but as that animal gets older, that protein requirement goes down. And this is something I like to throw in here, this point. Health is a function of immunity and nutrition. And when I work with the vets a lot, we tend to get together and give this presentation, talk about, we can give you every vaccine and medicine that there is out there. But if they don't have the right tools, the nutrition from a metabolic standpoint, they're not going to help them out. They're not going to respond to those vaccines or those treatments that we give them. Just a point of reference, I could put everybody to sleep before supper talking about the different minerals and what they do. But I do like to throw these in here just to give you an idea. We talk a lot about macro or major minerals, and then micro or minor minerals. And it doesn't mean they're any less or more important. It's the amount that they're needed in. So these major or macro minerals, you can see as a percentage is the requirement. And so you can see down through here, and you notice that we have some max tolerable levels, the magnesium, the potassium, and the sulfur. And the reason is we start getting into mineral interactions if we get some of these too high. Potassium, especially this time of year, we got lush winter grazing coming on, interferes with magnesium absorption. We get into things like grass tetany. And then we look at our micro minerals or minor minerals. And notice here it says parts per million. So that means that it's needed on a much smaller amount, but they're still just as important. And the ones we typically focus on are the zinc, copper, and selenium in our part of the world. And I believe some of those deficiencies are up y'all's way as well, mainly because they're deficient in our forages and our soils for the most part, but also we have some interactions, sulfur especially with our copper and our selenium, but also our copper to zinc ratio. And I don't want to get too far off in left field discussing the minerals specifically, but one of the things that I want to keep is about a 3-to-1 zinc to copper ratio. And you can see here 30 parts per million for zinc and 10 copper for the requirements. And that's because of the absorption. If we start getting those out of balance, then it affects the other's absorption. And if we talked about earlier, if we hit them with a slug of copper, then we may inadvertently create a zinc deficiency. So that's why it goes back to that forage testing, looking at our feeds, looking at that mineral tag, and trying to balance across the entire ration and diet. Just put this in here then. We talked about feed intake being higher and lower. So if you look at this, and this is straight out of the NRC, which is the main book we use for looking at requirements. If you look at normal cattle and what these different requirements are, if you got stress calves, well, basically you have to double everything. So the requirement of what you need in their feed goes up. And we tend to think then if we start looking at our own calves, this is some data from when I was in Virginia. We bought cell barn calves. So these are calves coming from everybody's. Most of these were straight off the cow. But we were doing some copper work. So we just took liver biopsies on all these calves. So typically these would be straight off the mama, straight off the weaning we talked about, no preconditioning. And I want to share this because if we assume that calf is getting enough minerals throughout its lifetime prior to weaning from its mother, they're not. We got to be careful, and because each one of these represents a calf for this 1 year. And just to give you a point of reference, there's the deficiency line. So 32% of those calves were deficient, 46% were some degree of marginal, and only 22% were in that normal range. So we could say, all right, go liver biopsy all your cattle, which is unrealistic. But the main thing is going back to that looking at the entire program and understanding where you are from a mineral standpoint, from a nutritional standpoint. And this is just real quick from a project we did. We actually fed an antagonist to make copper unavailable. And this kind of shows you an idea. So one line, the top line, are those that were on a copper sufficient diet. And then this other line is copper deficient diet. And the main thing I put it up here, so we fed an antagonist, a mineral that's high in some parts of the country, not here, but interacts with copper. And you can see in these copper deficient diets, over about by day 56, they can be in a deficient state where we can start seeing issues, decreased immune function. But also we turned around and looked at it too. We looked at copper repletion. So we fed them this diet to get the copper down low, and then we fed them either just a straight inorganic mineral or a chelated mineral. And interestingly, we didn't see much difference in the two, but the main thing I want to show is you can see from about here to here, it's about 28 days. If we have cattle in that marginal, if we put them on a good plan of nutrition, within 28 days, we can get them above that normal line, and then they should be okay. So the next idea I want to talk to you about, we talked about economical versus cheap feeds. And one of the things we've relied more and more on, I'd say over the past 20 years, are byproducts. And because typically we can get these at a reduced rate compared to a commercial feed. But now a lot of these are considered commercial feeds. But there are a lot of things out there that are available to us. And so I typically talk about knowing what's available, what the price of that is, when it's available is important, and how can we handle it properly, and any minerals. So we can do the math and decide what's the best value if we're looking at price per protein or price per pound of energy. And I put this picture up top. It may not show up very well on your screen, but one of the comments I get from some of our smaller producers is say, Lawton, I appreciate you talking about all these commodities, but we're just not set up to take bulk loads. Because that's one of the things I think about using some of these commodities is it allows you to take loads at different times of the year and store them. But this is one of our producers down in Southeast Georgia, and he decided, if you look real close, you can see some hay in the background. He took the end of his hay barn and made a commodity bay. So he can take a full truckload. That's a 50-50 mix of corn gluten and soy hull pellets. And it's under the barn, so it stays dry. So this will keep for quite a while. Humidity may get us a little bit in the summer, but for the main part, if we keep it dry, then it's going to be okay. But he used a little ingenuity. So I use this for two reasons. One, to show a little ingenuity can open doors for us from an economical standpoint, looking at our feeds. Because if you look at these things, if we were live, I would ask for volunteers to tell me what these are. Those are reject tank targets. So he lived close enough to one of the Army bases down here, and somehow he got to talking to somebody there, and they said if he'd come get them or have them hauled, he could have them for free. They look like essentially like big upside down concrete tees. Now, I thought it was funny that there was something that was not good enough to blow up with the tank. I figured they'd at least sit those over to the side and let the new guy shoot at those. But for some reason, there is such thing as a reject tank target. But that's just one idea. One of the ways that are another station, a way we went from being a price taker and just having to buy feed one bag at a time, or buy bag feed, is we took ton polytote bags, and the feed company would deliver if we would take at least 4 tons at a time. And so we take those 4 bags, we'd fill them up. They'd take the front end loader and then put it up under the barn. We put it on a pallet. And so we went from having to buy 50-pound bags to buying bulk loads, and it saved us a tremendous amount of money. I go through one of the examples with our heifer development program by booking feed and doing this. It saved us tremendous amount. And before I get ahead of myself, no, I don't talk about it later. But these types of strategies help us out tremendously. But now, if we start looking inside the rumen, or first, before I do that, I'll just give you some people say, well, what are byproduct feeds? And these are some, we see in Georgia. You probably see some of these up your way as well. But things like corn gluten and distillers grains from the corn industry, soybean hulls, wheat midds, cotton industry. We've got a huge cotton industry in Georgia, so you see a lot of whole cotton seed being fed down this way. Culled vegetables, things from the sugar production, peanuts. We get a lot of peanut products. If you get any peanut hulls, run away. That's one of the things. If you look down here, I will just talk about that one real quick. We see a lot of peanut hulls in South Georgia, but they're a little bit better than cardboard from a nutritional standpoint, from an energy standpoint. Essentially just something to fill up the rumen. But if we look inside that rumen and think about how it functions and what's the sources of energy. So we are going to focus a little bit on nutrition and ruminant, we'll say physiology. That's kind of a big word. But just to help you understand, how do we kickstart and get these calves going? Well, if we look in the rumen and think in general, what are the sources of energy? Typically, we talk about fiber-based energy and starch-based energy. And if we look in that rumen and what makes that rumen function, it's microbes. It's the bacteria that are able to break down things that we as monogastrics cannot. And in a general sense, we have fiber digesting bacteria and we have starch digesting bacteria. Cattle are built to be fiber digesters, forage. And if we feed a high forage diet, as long as it's high quality forage, we don't run into problems. Now, we've started using corn over the past 100 or so years because it's very high caloric density. We can get into problems if we feed way too much too fast. We get into acidosis, but also we can get to some efficiency standpoint. And if we look at it from just the acidosis standpoint, or founder, you may hear some people call it founder. What exactly is happening is when we feed something that's very fermentable, we call it fermentable carbohydrates, very rapidly fermentable. So we take something like corn, ground corn especially, and when we first feed it, we see a flush of growth of all the bacteria. We see a lot of VFAs, volatile fatty acids, which are the energy currency in that rumen. But as that name implies, they're acids. So as that VFA production increases, if it increases too quickly, that pH will start to drop. So we're becoming a little more acidic. And then we start focusing on certain bacteria that can survive in that low pH, acidic environments. And then those specifically start producing more lactic acid. That pH starts to drop even further. Then we start seeing more of just a kill off of a lot of those bacteria because they can't survive. That pH drops further. And then we get to this continuous feedback. If it gets really bad, then it gets into the whole system. But if we just look in that rumen, we can have what we call subacute acidosis, acute acidosis. But essentially what we're thinking about is the health of that animal and the health of the rumen. Because if we look inside the rumen, and if anybody's been able to reach their arm in a cannulated steer and you feel the lining, they call it the shag carpet, because they have all these finger-like projections, these papillae that stick out from the rumen to increase the surface area. And that's because those VFAs are absorbed across that rumen wall to go to the liver and then convert into things like glucose. And for optimal nutrient absorption, we need that pH to be between 6 and 6.2. When we get in that acidotic situation, that high acidic, low pH can start to burn back those finger-like projections. And if it gets really bad, then we can create permanent damage. If it drops below 5.5, get down to close to 5, that's that acute acidosis where we just burn that rumen wall, and then we get into permanent issues. Interestingly, a side note, I don't know if there's many deer hunters, but we're seeing some of this too in the deer world where people are feeding corn. If you go dump out a big thing of corn, even though deer are built just a little bit different, their rumens, still a big slug of corn can create acidosis or founder, or even we're seeing hoof problems in some of the deer. So with that, I'm not saying that corn's a bad thing. We just have to be very careful with how we feed it. And just to give you a little bit too, we can talk about the efficiency in the rumen of how, if you have starch digesters and fiber digesters, they're using different sources of energy, but they're also competing for other nutrients such as nitrogen. And this is a really great study they did at Oklahoma State. It's been over 30 years ago now, but I think this is a great way to illustrate an efficiency standpoint. And what they did is that they fed these animals on marginal hay, either no corn all the way up to 6.6 pounds, with a little bit of cottonseed meal to make sure there was some energy, protein there. And they looked at hay. This DMI means dry matter intake. So how much hay did they consume? Total dry matter intake. So hay plus corn plus cottonseed meal. Don't worry about digestible organic matter intake, but look at this bottom one, this hay organic matter digestibility. How digestible was the hay fraction, the fiber fraction? So if you look at no corn as a baseline, they're eating about 19 pounds of hay. Total intake is 20.9 because they did have that about 1.5 pounds of cottonseed meal for protein. And that hay is 36.5% digestible. We add a little bit of corn, not much changes. Everything stays about the same. We see some substitutive effect. So they're replacing some of the hay for some of the corn. No big deal, it's just increasing the energy. But look what happens as we start pushing corn more and more in the diet. You can see total intake goes down and hay digestibility goes down. We're creating a less efficient environment in the rumen, so we see lower efficiency. That doesn't mean the cattle won't gain. It just means they got to focus more on that corn, and we see that more like in a feedlot where we're focused on corn starch base because we're going after it for that white fat we associate with marbling. But what I like they turned around then and did a similar study, but they used soybean hull pellets, which is digestible fiber. All the energy in soy hull pellets is pretty much from fiber-based energy, no starch. But if we just pull all these numbers up, they do the same thing. You can see that hay intake stays pretty much the same. It goes down a little bit up here, but the organic matter digestibility, that fiber digestibility actually increases. So we've created or maintained an efficient environment in that rumen. So just to think about that, again, I'm not telling you don't feed corn. I'm just saying we have to look at the bigger picture and how corn fits in there from a fiber digestibility standpoint. Using some starch and mainly fiber-based energy in these background. I think it helps them out, helps that rumen stay healthy in a backgrounding phase. So how do we buy these? We can spend a lot of time just talking on this. I typically say find some way to get everything on an even playing field. So if we know the price per ton, we know the dry matter content. Up y'all's way, you'll probably see more wet distillers than we do down this way. So that's something to take, wet versus dry, nutrient content. And then we can start doing some math. And this is the way I evaluate feeds, is I look at it on a per ton basis, what the price is, adjust for percent dry matter. So divide by dry matter, divide by percent nutrient, divide by 2,000. And that gives you a price per pound of nutrient that we're looking at. And just to give you an example, let's say corn gluten's $2.20 a ton. It would come out to be $4.89 per pound of protein. Now, don't quote me on any of these prices. I pulled this from an older presentation, so these may not be, especially in your neck of the woods, may be different prices. But at the time I put these together, soybean meal was very high at $6.25 a ton. It actually was costing us more per pound, a lot more per pound. So we're looking at 65.5 cents per pound of protein. But when we start doing this math, it allows us to start effectively picking out feeds that are going to be more economical. I talked a little bit about it earlier, but just almost kind of a joke, but not really. Is when do we procure feeds? Well, if we wait till this period, probably everybody else needs them as well. You know, this is a drought situation. We need some hay replacer rations. But if we're looking at backgrounding calves, if we start looking at some of these concepts of how do we look at a bulk feed or book feeds, it allows us to buy them when they are traditionally lower or when we determine our price point is, and we could store them and feed them later when we're weaning our calves, or even use it on our calves and our cow herd. I put this in here just as a reference. There's a lot of moving parts in here, but just some general, if we want to increase weight gains on marginal forage or we want to extend winter grazing, those are two situations I typically questions on for weaned calves. And there's a lot of different variables here, and we can fine tune it. And I believe Courtney has the slides and she can distribute those. But just to give you some concepts of what are some different types of rations we can put together, and some guidelines there in the comments of how to use them. And then the last part here, when we talk about the nutrition part, is I had one producer in Central Georgia. He'd always call and say, all right, is it going to pay for me to feed these calves? And I'd say, Jack, it depends. I need to know several things. So I started looking at these things, these return on feed comparison. Now, the first thing you may notice is Bahia grass. And that's, of course, we're looking in South Georgia. But this is some of the things we need to consider. You see the stars there. How big are your calves? What is the forage base? How long are you looking at doing it? And what are you going to feed them? And so in this situation, he had early wean calves, 400 weight calves, looking at Bahia grass pastures. Want to retain ownership for 45 days just to get them moving forward a little bit, get them straightened out. And he had a 50-50 mix of corn gluten and soy hull pellets. And what I want to do then is look at, on a price per ton basis, what are the different things? What are the different situations? So each one of these lines, so we're looking at across the bottom level supplementation as a percent of body weight, 0.5%, 1%. So this for these calves would be 2 pounds, 4 pounds, 6 pounds, and 8 pounds, right? Because percent of the body weight. And return on feed, dollars per head. And at different feed costs. And you can see that the lower cost has a bigger return, obviously, because that nutrition is staying the same. We're just saying the feed's costing us less. But one of the things I really like about this is we typically see about 1% of body weight is where we see the breaking point of return on feed cost. We're still making money out here, but we're leveling off, or if the feed's too expensive, we're actually starting to go down in what our feed is, because we're usually most efficient with the first part, the first 1% of the body weight that we give them. But that's the type of exercise we can go through when we're putting together some of these programs of, does it pay to retain these calves? What do we have available? Will it work to do something? Justin, are there any questions? I was going to talk a little bit about creep feeding and implants just quickly, but just want to stop maybe see if there's a question before we get into that.
Yeah, one that pops out here to me while you're talking about different feed sources would be about cottonseed hulls versus soy hulls. We use a lot of soy hull pellets here in Tennessee, of course, and I know you do in Georgia. We don't always get as good access to cotton byproducts, but do in some parts of the state, west and southwest, are able to get to some cottonseed hulls, and other parts too. It's just a little more expensive, but comparison on some of those energy sources.
Sure. So that's, I wish I had something I could throw up real quick and show you that. So we sometimes get confused with cottonseed hulls, Hull, and then whole cottonseed, Whole. Very different.
Specifically about hulls, but if you can address both, that'd be great.
Okay. So the difference is a whole cottonseed is what it says. You have that whole seed that you're feeding, and it tends to be very high in energy, depending on because it's got fat in it. As well as digestible fiber. And it typically can run anywhere between 90 and 100% TDN because of that fat content. And it's fairly high in protein, typically low to mid 20s on protein content. We typically say we limit those just because of the fat content. But now if we look at cottonseed hulls, Hulls, that's what's left after they crush the cottonseed to get the oil out and everything else. So it is a roughage source. It is low in protein, low in energy, but we typically see it in feedlot rations. Dairies use it a lot as a roughage source. Cattle like it. It's very palatable. So if you compare it to soy hulls, which is the same concept as the outside of that seed after they've crushed it, much lower in digestibility. So you're looking at digestibility on soy hulls in the 70s. But on cottonseed hulls down in the 40s typically. So there's a world of difference between those two when you take that in consideration. Typically cottonseed hulls, as I said earlier, is just a roughage source. And typically it tends to be relatively high price compared to other things, because I think a lot of the other industries, like I said, the dairy industry and the feedlot industry likes to use them as roughage sources. Did that answer it?
It does really well. And kind of while you're at it, I'll throw another one in there that's somewhat related, but you mentioned corn earlier and kind of talked a little bit about its, different amounts of usage, I guess, over the years, depending on price and knowing how to feed it. What about corn silage? We get questions a lot of times when the price of corn goes down, and, people might be a little more willing to chop it instead of shell it. So just your take in general on using corn silage.
Yeah, it's great stuff. We do a lot of up at our Blairsville unit, which is not far from the y'all's neck of the woods up in our mountain station. They put up corn silage every year to background cattle on, and it's a great source. The nice thing is it's relatively high in energy but it's also high in fiber. It's got enough fiber because you think about we're chopping that corn plant at a maturity level where there's a decent amount of lignin, a decent amount of that roughage factor. So it's got energy to it, but it also has some roughage to it. And just give an idea of what we feed is corn solids with just 4 pounds or about 0.5% of body weight to feeder calves, weaned calves, stocker calves, and they're gaining anywhere from around 2.25, 2.5 pounds a day. So I guess I'm gonna get past the discussion of is it economically viable to grow it, chop it, and put it up. But if we're talking about just from a strictly nutritional standpoint, it's great stuff because you get the energy and you get some roughage factor to it. Doesn't have much protein. You definitely need to add some protein to it, especially for calves.
Yeah. And maybe just the last one I'll ask you here before you move on to the next section is I think you mentioned certainly talked a little bit about dry matter content and as fed versus dry matter. Maybe just recap that really quickly.
Good point. So when we look at feeds, they're on an as fed basis. And we talk about that, that's essentially a handful of stuff you got right here in front of you. But from a nutritional standpoint, we evaluate them on a dry matter basis. So we determine what the dry matter content is, or the moisture content, and then we adjust the nutritional base on a dry matter basis. And the reason for that is to allow us to compare apples to apples of a wet feed versus a drier feed. And you can think of something like a wet distillers versus dry distillers, or something like baleage or corn silage versus dry hay. We look at a nutritional standpoint, and then we realize how much we have to feed. Because if you look at something like corn silage, it's 33% dry matter. So that means it's 67% moisture. So there's a lot of moisture there. Or if you take something like hay, if we put up hay like we should, it's going to be about 85% dry matter, only 15% moisture. So you think about then about feed amounts, but the reason we look at things on a dry matter basis is to get everything on an even playing field and understand what type of actual nutrient is there to analyze those feeds, forages, where we're looking at.
Okay, great. Yeah, and I've got some other questions. I'll just tell everybody while we're here doing this that I've left several questions unanswered. So I'll just let everybody know, if you don't see that I've answered your question in the Q&A box, I'm holding it to ask Lawton toward the end, kind of a recap of some of these things. So
okay, well, I'm just going to do a couple more things real quick, and then we'll just get into the full question and answer situation.
that sounds.
Well, I apologize. I didn't show up very well. It should be a little grayed out so you can read it. But this was, we wanted to look at creep feeding and implants. So we talked earlier about creep feeding. And just a quick concept of creep feeding. I'll give you the economist answer when somebody says, is it worth creep feeding my calves? I'll say it depends. And it gets back to the nutritional side of it, the efficiency side of it, and what we're ultimately the goal, the next step is going to be. Because if we look at creep feeding, if we do just a full choice, like we have here with our creep feeders, we're free choice in something that's got a lot of corn, soybean meal, and they're just tanking up. So if we're just maximizing growth, we're not worried about the economics, it's a good idea. I'm a big fan of limit fed creep feed rations. So we're doing something like maybe a little bit of soybean meal or a little bit of distillers, maybe a little bit of corn. But we're either hand feeding it or we're using something like salt to limit it, because we're maximizing efficiency. So kind of going back to that, will it pay to feed for them to feed them? And we're looking at weaned calves, but from a creep feed standpoint, it's the same concept. If we can take the nutrients we need, which typically on some of our forages, they need a little more protein and a little more energy in that pre-weaning phase, and we're giving to them just enough so we're seeing a bigger return on what we're giving them. The ceiling is not the same, but our efficiency, our return on investment is much better. So that kind of talk a little bit about the creep feeding. But then if we flip over and we talk about implants, and I apologize, I didn't put any slides in here talking about the different types of implants, but these are the implants that we put in the back of their ear, slide it up under their ear. One of the things that we need to make sure is that they're on a good plane of nutrition if we're going to implant these calves, because they need those building blocks in order to grow better. And so what we looked at here is down at our Lappaha station. So one, we had Bahia grass, but also had some ear influence down there. And each of these, we had 24 in each group, and they were either in a creep feed or no creep situation. But then with each of those, then we had half of those we would put an implant in, and half of them we wouldn't. The calves were implanted with Cinevex C, and the steers, they were all implanted with Cinevex C at 60 to 90 days, and then they were implanted with Cinevex S 70 days later. So a double implant pre-weaning. And some of these concepts are post-weaning as well. I apologize, I didn't know my own technology there. So you can see there the animation of what we're looking at. But if we look at the what we found out, so you can see our 4 treatments: no creep, no implant, no creep feed, implant, creep feed, no implant, and then creep feed, implant. And you can see, okay, average daily gain. So you can see the increase in average daily gain. But this is something to look at is no creep feed, no implant, no creep implant. We did see an improvement, but you can see that there's almost not as much difference between no creep and the creep plus no implant. So this kind of illustrates they need the building blocks on top of the implant to move forward. You can see the weaning weights and then that value. And we did consider there was a slide as they got bigger, a $5 slide per hundredweight. but you can see the difference in overall value of those calves. And then the premium need. And the reason I put this in here is the biggest question or backlash, or what we see about implants is, well, I'm going for a natural market. I'm natural. These are naturally produced calves. I don't want to put an implant. And the problem I see is that some of these producers they don't have them marketed correctly. They're just hoping that maybe they'll take them to the sale barn and somebody will pay them more for it. So this too, though, is to look at what you need as a premium to overcome the production loss. And really, we just need to look at these two, the no creep implant versus the creep implant. So essentially, you're saying if you're using creep feeding and you're deciding not to implant in this situation, then we need to have at least a $48.50 premium per head in this situation based on these prices to overcome the lack of production that we're going to get with that implant.
Hey, Lawton, real quick, before you go on, this is one of those instances where we have some folks that are brand new to the cattle business that might be here on the webinar, and just tell us about what an implant is.
Okay, sure. So an implant, if you're new to the cattle industry, you're not as familiar with them, it is a hormone-based implant. So with these little pellets, and you see, I wish I apologize for not putting some pictures in here, Justin, but typically call it like an implant gun or implant applicator. And it's a needle that slides up under the skin, and we typically put it behind the ear and puts these little pellets behind their ear. And the reason they do that is it's a slow release. There's estradiol. There are different types of them, and we can get you some of that information. I don't want to get too far into the science part of it, but the concept is those hormones, as they're released, they improve. Essentially, what they're doing is they're improving the energy metabolism of those animals, allowing them to be more efficient with the feeds that we're giving them. So that's, as you're seeing here, if we say no implant versus implant, so these calves did not get any implant put in the back of their ear versus these that did have one put in their ear. So we're giving them this treatment that allows them to grow more efficiently. Now, what happens is if we look at it from a public perception standpoint, we talk a lot about hormone-free beef, and technically there's no such thing as hormone-free beef. All meat tissue has hormones in it, but no added implants. The concept is, if you're in a natural market, you cannot implant your cattle, I guess, for not to try to get too far off in the discussion. Justin, do you have anything you want to add to that?
No, just that the types of growth promotants that are used in those implants are very readily metabolized. So the slow release of the implant, once it's done, then you wouldn't be able to find trace amounts of that actual hormone in the actual beef product. So they've been used for many years in beef cattle production. And I think, to me, a key concept in sustainability for producing more beef on limited resources and proven safe and effective in those ways.
Yeah, exactly. We have to improve our efficiencies to maintain our sustainability. But at the end of the day, I tell producers, you have to be able to look at the market you're going for, market them properly, know how to attain that market, if you're going to take out one of these efficiency improving technologies, such as implanting. All right, well, with that, where's my screen? Oh, I'm frozen. There we go. I will stop there. I see we're at the 7:48, so we've been here for quite a while now. And we can keep, well, I'll sit here as long as anybody else wants to talk or ask questions.
Yeah, so I have several good questions here in the Q&A box. One thing I'll do before I get into asking those, and I didn't mention this at the start of the webinar, but so while I have everybody's attention, please listen close to this next part. It'll be very important to you. So after the webinar is ended, so when Courtney hits end meeting on the webinar, in your window or your web browser, there will be a link that shows up automatically to click to go to a survey. And it'll ask you if you want to go to that survey or stay on Zoom. If you'll click to go to that survey and fill out those questions, that's what we use as your attendance record. So that we'll send that to your agent. Then they'll be able to see that you actually attended the webinar tonight. So very important that once the meeting is ended and you see that link to that survey, that you click that, fill out that survey real quick, and then you'll be done for the evening. And I'll mention that again here after we get done with questions. One thing we have tried to do with all these is end right at 7 o'clock Central, 8 o'clock Eastern. So we have 10 minutes for a few questions, and I'll try to get these in here. While we're still on implants, let's see, safety implant heifers that you're going to keep is a question we usually get. I'll take a stab at it if you want me to, starting out, Lawton. And it's to me, and I've answered a couple other questions that were in the chat that I just typed an answer to, that it's very important to go by the label on the implants that you purchase. Go by the label. Those have been, vetted through the USDA and they've been approved. So if you go by that label, that's the important part. Now I'll say this, that for me personally, if I know the genetics, the genetic capability of those heifers I'm keeping back with the intention of making replacements out of, and I know that I'll be able to deliver the nutrition they need, my default answer to that is that I would not implant those unless the packaging, the label on the implant you intend to use explicitly says that it's safe to use for heifers that you intend to keep for replacements, and it won't affect reproductive function later on as you try to breed them early in that first breeding season. Your take on that, Lawton?
Sure. You're the repro guy. Yes.
Got you. All right. I'm going to go back up here and maybe run back up, I guess, in earlier in your presentation. Had a few questions here about forage testing. Had several that asked about where they could get their forages tested. So we put in some answers to that. Basically, again, going back to the fact that we're a true county-based system. If you ever have questions like that about getting your forage tested, talk to your local county agent. They'll get you in contact with our forage lab for the state of Tennessee. So we have the plant pest and soil lab in Nashville that does forage testing. They do it in conjunction with lab on campus there in Knoxville. And then most of those agents will be able to help you learn how to actually take those forage samples, how often you should do it. One question I'll ask you though, Lawton, here too, is there are a few questions in testing standing forage. We talk a lot about hay testing. Do you do much of that? Take a pasture sample and have a forage analysis on it?
Sometimes, but it really depends on the production system, because typically, and I'm talking, and maybe more so for a Georgia situation. So we're talking about our perennial grasses, such as our Bermuda grass and fescue, is where we are typically in production. We're not as worried about, are we meeting the energy and protein requirements? But I do recommend, if we're not taking any hay off of those pastures, that we do test them so we get an idea what the mineral content is. One of the things I do tell people, though, looking at, if we're thinking about your grazing and cutting hay in similar situations, is that we can use our hay sample to give us an idea of what's going on in the growing pasture, because in theory, we're cutting that hay at the optimal time in a similar pasture. So it gives us an idea of what's going on in that grazed pasture. So I usually say, let's take baby steps into this, and let's start with our hay. And when do you test that? Is test it by cutting. So if we get 3 cuttings, we're going to test each of those cuttings. Or if we got 10 different fields, we test all those different fields based on our cutting, because then we can have so much variability between fields and between cutting that it's really good to know exactly what's there, so we can match different forages for different either stage of production with our cows or saving the higher quality for our calves.
So I'm going to combine a few questions here, and this will be the most oddly formulated question you've ever heard with several different components. Even coming from me, it'll be the strangest. So if I had access to a grape byproduct from a winery, high sugar content, you think it'd be worth feeding? If I didn't feed it correctly and caused acidosis, what would some of those symptoms of acidosis be? And if you do think I could use it, what would the shelf life be in storage?
Okay, so you're getting,
Like that.
I assume it's a high moisture product. It's known that it has a high sugar content. I'll jump to the storage. The good thing is it would ensile nicely if you want to come up with a strategy there. But it depends on the time of year. We've done some of this. It would be similar with our, we did some projects with some grocery store waste, which was a lot of fruit. So it has some high sugar content. And in the winter, it'd keep for several weeks. But in the summer, it depends on the time of year and the weather. In the summer, it wouldn't last. We'd have to feed it up pretty quickly just because of spoilage, any other type of high moisture, high sugar content feed. But to get back to the first part of the acidosis, so we can, if we just dump it out and it truly has a high sugar content, we can get into acidosis situations. But it would be interesting to see what the moisture content is. So you could say, all right, well, I'm dumping it out if you got some concept of what that actual intake is, because if it's some of these things, we look at them, they're 10% dry matter, so they're 90% moisture. So that means you could feed 50 pounds of it, but they're only getting 5 pounds of dry matter out of it. So it may not be as critical situation if they have other forage and other things available. But so what are some of the signs? If there's things that are very rapidly fermentable, we can see some bloat going on. You know, so a lot of times we're talking about in feedlots seeing bloat. But typically what we're going to see is cattle, their feed intake, it goes up and down. They eat a lot one day, they go off feed. They go up and they come back down. But also look at their manure. I say look at manure. If you get that grayish color, it's runny, maybe it looks a little watery. Those are signs we're getting into acidosis. If you start seeing blood, then you really know we're having bad problems because it's getting further down the line. But that's my typical recommendation is look for cyclic intake, but also look at the manure. Make sure. Now, you may not like what you see on ryegrass where it just shoots out the back end, but it's just got a gray color to it. That is a key telltale sign that we may be getting in some acidotic situations.
Okay.
Were there other parts to it? I can't remember.
I think they got it all. I was kind of trying to combine maybe a little too much there, but just seeing how well you take it too. Had several questions about minerals when you're asking that, or when you're talking about mineral supplementation, stuff like, is it difficult to or how can you add a individual mineral component to a free choice mineral mix, injectable minerals, some of those things. We got 3 minutes here to kind of wrap up. If you want to just wrap up on talking about minerals, and then we'll try to get some of these others addressed just through email, or if they want to contact their agent. Sure.
So the thing about minerals, I tell the story. I was giving a program one time, and a guy walks up with 4 tags and says, "Which one do I feed?" And I asked him, I said, "Well, where's your forage sample?" And he said, "I don't have one." And I asked him, I said, "Well, which one's the most expensive?" And he pointed, I said, "Well, feed that one." And that kind of got his attention. I said, if you can't tell me the situation, I'm going to cover my butt and just assume the most expensive one is what you need to do. But that it goes back to that forage test, knowing what's there and adding single nutrients, unless we're doing custom blends, it's not necessarily that easy. But if we have that forage sample, we can start looking at different ones that are available and seeing which one best meets our most limiting nutrients or the limiting nutrients in the right amount. We're rarely ever going to the store and buying off the shelf going to meet everything perfectly. But we still we have a little bit of wiggle room in there with our different minerals to get as close as we can. It's okay if we're not a perfect 3-to-1 on zinc to copper in the total diet, but as long as we're close, we should be okay. Injectable minerals, they have their place. I always say that injectable minerals help when we know we got a situation we need to correct, but we don't have that 30 days to do it through a feed program, that we have to do it to give them a boost and then allow that nutritional program to catch up. You know, we look at receiving cattle, or let's say we're getting ready to feed heifers or breed heifers next month or in a week or two and realize that we have a mineral issue going on. I'm trying to remember what else was there another part to it, Justin?
I think you covered everything I saw just in that synopsis. The fact that you really need to know what you need first, right? And
That's right.
and purchase to fill those gaps the best you can. And there might be some selection in that too. You know, culling open cows. I always have to work a little repro in there, right? If you cull open cows, you'll find the ones that can make it on the mineral you have.
Yeah, there you go.
Right. Well, with that, one thing I know is that we need to stick to the timeline so everybody has their evenings planned around this. And I appreciate you doing that. I mean, it's perfect timing. I've never seen one of us extension guys give a talk that wrapped up right on time with the Q&A. So it's pretty impressive. It's almost like you've been doing this for a while.
It's probably luck. I'd rather be lucky than good any day.
Yep, I'll take that too. But I really sincerely appreciate you doing this for us tonight, Lawton. A lot of really positive comments here in the chat and the Q&A box. And I think we've learned a lot. One thing we can't always do is get to all the questions, but everybody out there that didn't get a question answered this evening, I tried to leave some of those that might fit really well in one of the upcoming webinars. So bring those with you to the next ones. And I'll say, remember that whenever this ends, you'll have a link come up in the window that you're looking at there to go directly to a survey. Very important that you go ahead and fill that survey out here before you wrap up this evening, so that we can capture y'all's attendance on the webinar here tonight. And again, Lawton, I just say thank you very much for spending your evening here with us and giving us some good information based on a lot of years of experience. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. If there's everything else I can do up y'all's way, maybe one day I can come back and visit. But happy to help out. Anything else comes up, maybe questions that don't get answered, we need to dive in more. Please just let me know.
Great. Thank you. Courtney, do you have anything else to add?
Well, I'll just add that if something happens and you either exit off that browser or you don't see the link for the survey, don't freak out. I have it set to where it's going to send you a follow-up email tomorrow that also has a survey link. So if you don't get a chance to answer it, you can answer it there.
Yep. And there will be space for you guys to leave some comments of how we can do this better going forward. And with that, I'll say good night and look forward to seeing you next Monday here at about the same time.
Good night, everybody. Appreciate y'all letting me be a part of it.
Great. Thank you. See you guys.